Hi, welcome to another Fire Drill Friday teach-in. I'm sitting with an iconic labor leader, organizer for so many decades, a woman who is unique in so many ways, the amazing Dolores Huerta, co-founder with Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers Union. What I love is this is the woman that negotiated the contracts between the farmers and the union. And I'm just so excited to have you here. I'm going to read your biography. She co-founded also the Agricultural Workers Association in 1960. Well, that's what became the United Farm Workers Union. Dolores has worked to improve social and economic conditions for farm workers and to fight discrimination, and to this day, she continues her efforts to improve the lives of workers, immigrants, and women. And she is also the president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. Dolores, you've had the most amazing and impactful life that has literally changed the fabric of American history. Can you tell us about yourself and your work?
Well, I think I've been very blessed and very fortunate to have found the world of activism, and to find that if you really convince people that they have power and that they can change their situation, that this is how we make things happen. And instead of complaining about the situations that people live in, but if people know they can come together, take direct action by coming together, by organizing. But it takes that effort in the first place to talk to people and let them know, look, you don't have to put up with a situation like we did with farm workers, or like we're doing, say, with women, and many other causes. And of course, with climate change, as we know, that people, once they understand and they know what the procedures are, what the processes are, that and it's magical. It's really magical when you see people get that enlightened and then they know that they have the power to change.
Yeah, and it changes your person inside too.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Especially when you know you're doing something for a cause that's bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
I think that's what really inspires people also.
When you began the movement that would later become the United Farm Workers, you were up against seemingly impossible odds. I mean, it just seems impossible that you could organize migrant workers in the fields. What were the main moments? What were the main things that led to the success of forming that union?
I think patience is important, and because a lot of people don't realize that, before we had that first strike in Delano, the big grape strike, that we had been organizing for 3 years. And we had been organizing in people's homes, group by group, family by family, and forming this real chain of house meetings, and then bringing them all together so that they could see that they were not alone, but there were other people out there. But the whole idea of educating them and convincing them, and by giving them examples of, Cesar and I belong to this other organization called the Community Service Organization, and this is where we learned our organizing skills from the great Fred Ross Sr. He's the one that taught us that, to have that type of patience. And it's really wonderful when you see that manifests itself, and when people are able then to take bigger steps, and by coming together. So,
Yeah.
and so we use the same method of organizing in my foundation, where we're fighting the school to prison pipeline, and getting people involved in running for office and things of that nature. Yeah.
That's the key, isn't it?
It is.
Taking people, individuals, and bringing them together, and they can see the power in numbers.
Absolutely.
That individually. You know what's so interesting? I'm just beginning to understand this, that it started in the 80s with Reagan. This exaltation of individualism, and then Thatcher over in England. Forget the commons, forget the public sphere. It's all about me individually and my family, and we become into a smaller and smaller bubble. and that is a tool of the ruling class.
Exactly. And that's what I tell people because, one of the things that we're finding, of course, is racism. And so in my talks that I give, I just remind people that we only have one human race, it's Homo sapiens. And we don't have a lot of different races. We have a lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different nationalities, a lot of different cultures, but we only have one human race. And where did our human race begin? It began in Africa. And, so I like to say we're all Africans of different shades and colors, and we can say that to the KKK and these white nationalists, get over it, you're Africans, okay, to begin with. But the other thing, too, is that we survived on this planet by taking care of each other, protecting each other, because we are probably the weakest of the animal chain, and we could have been lunch for all of the animals, right? But the only way that we survive that is by coming together and protecting each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the basic rule of our existence, and I guess we can say that that's what could come into play now when we have these major issues about the survival of human beings on our planet.
What is it that gives you hope when times are so dark?
Well, I think we have to look backward. As you know, Jane, we look back and see the accomplishments that were made by people coming together. Both of us were active in the 60s, and I like to say to young people, if you missed the 60s, guess what? We're back.
Right.
We're back. We had a lot of a cultural revolution, I believe, back then. I think now we're in the phase where we're having more of an economic revolution to kind of fix the inequities that we have in economics and money and the way people live. And so, but I think we have a lot of new tools. As you know, we now have the internet, so that everything is transparent. People can get information very quickly. And so we have new tools that can now help us. But the main thing is that we just have to remember that lesson that one person can't do it by themselves, that we've got to have all of us organized together to make it happen.
Yeah. How do you think the environmental climate movement can work with the social justice and labor movements to better articulate the vision for a just transition? How can we make that happen better?
Well, I think that the environmental movement is going to be part and parcel of every movement, because this is something that's going to affect all of us. Not any individual is going to survive this, what's happening to our planet. And I think we've seen the demonstrations of this in Australia, what happened in Australia, where you have a country that was using coal as their main source, and then we saw these horrible fires, where people died and millions of animals died. And so you might say that the picture is there. We've seen it also in California. We've seen it now with the horrible floods and hurricanes in Puerto Rico and in the Midwest and in the South. So the picture is there. And so we know that regardless of what movement we're in, whether we're in the Me Too, the women's movement, the immigrant rights movement, and to end racism, civil rights movement, that all of us have got to make the environment part of what we do. It's got to be part of our agenda, I think. But I think a lot of times people don't know, well, what can I do? They need like a little toolkit, or they need an agenda so that they could say, okay, I am part of the environmental movement and this is what I am doing.
Farm workers, the men and women that bring us our food, are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And yet they're very vulnerable because many of them are not documented. First of all, what ways is the climate crisis affecting farm workers? And then the second question is, how do you think we can recruit farm workers and help them confront this crisis that's impacting us all?
Well, farm workers, since they work with plants and they work with the earth, they're the ones I think that are closest, and they know what the effects of the environment are. Number one, when we have the temperature climbing so hot that people are dying, literally dying in the fields from heat. And I know that there's been some measures to say, okay, we can provide shade, but that's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. We know that we need a certain type of heat to be able to make the products, say like the grapes, get the sugar so that they can be picked. But when you have the climate change, the changes that we're having right now, it's definitely going to affect our food supply. And we saw this happen in California with the cherry crop. this year, and it's not just about the climate getting hotter. It's about the climate, the way that it varies. I mean, like I live in Bakersfield, California, which, by the way, Jane, was the hottest city in the United States, I believe, in 2018. Because at night it doesn't get cool; it remains hot.
How hot did it get?
Well, it would go up to 112 degrees, in Bakersfield, and maybe even hotter than that. So this definitely affects the crops. And so the farm workers, not only physically are they being affected, but the farmers themselves, the growers, agribusiness, they're affected. And then at the end of that, the consumers are going to be affected. Because if our food supply is somehow jeopardized, that's going to affect every single person in the country. Mm-hmm. And since California particularly, we supply food for much of the world. It's not just the United States. That means that the whole world is going to be affected. And then I think this also affects people, as you know, in other countries. So we have so many refugees coming because some of where they have to grow their own food, and the climates have been so hot that their crops are not growing, so they have to eat, and you cannot keep people from food, so they have to migrate. And where do they come? They come north. They come to the United States.
Right.
And I think this is probably true of other countries also.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I have talked to Cassie Siegel, who is the director of the Center for Biological Diversity, and we were talking about the unlined, uncovered pits where the fossil fuel industry dumps its poisoned, pollutant-laden water and sludge that leaks into the aquifers, the underground supplies of water. It's sprayed on vegetables. To what extent are farm workers being affected by this?
Oh, very much so. As you know, all of those things that they put on our food, and especially farm workers that live in the farm worker communities, we have, as you know, these high rates of children that are born with deformities, high rates of cancer. My son-in-law, who just retired from the Highway Patrol, his father, his first cousin, and his first cousin died, of cancer, and now his mother has been afflicted with it. 3 members of that one family, and we see this throughout the San Joaquin Valley, where people are so affected, and even in Bakersfield, for instance, where we have the oil industry. There was a big oil spill over there that also jeopardized some of the drinking water, and it's happening. We were all partners at the North Dakota reservation there, where people were trying to stop this oil pipeline. Standing Rock, mm-hmm. with this oil pipeline that was going through there, and we know that Native Americans in Canada are also fighting this. So it's these struggles are all over the planet right now, where people are trying to save our planet and save our Mother Earth from contamination.
There's a very important center at Yale University that does research on people's attitudes about climate globally, and they said that of all the ethnicities in the world, the ones that care the most about the climate crisis are Latinos and Latinas. Globally, this is true.
Well, it might be because of indigenous roots.
Yeah.
That Latinos have.
Yeah. So one challenge for us is being able to organize mm-hmm. the Latino communities, mm-hmm. not just farm workers, mm-hmm. but all the Latino communities in this country, to understand the importance of attacking or confronting climate change. Mm-hmm. How do we go about doing that, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a combination of not just the Latino community, but we have to think of the people that are in power, so to speak, the people that are in our legislatures, on our board of supervisors. I mean, as an example, just recently in Bakersfield, California, again, this is like the heart of the petroleum industry in California. We get the majority of our petroleum comes from Bakersfield, and we know that that oil is going to be running out. They're going to be running out of oil in about 20 or 30 years, and yet there's no adjustments being made so when the oil is gone. So they, one of the Governor Newsom's people came down to Bakersfield to have a hearing on this issue. Well, the oil industry just organized, and they had 1,000 people there, and all just talking about how important oil is for the economy. And it's kind of like they're in denial, number one, that this oil is going to end. And they won't even admit that it has been harmful to the environment. They just don't even admit it. They won't even acknowledge it, as you know, these oil companies. And so it's not just about organizing the Latinos, and many of the oil workers are Latinos, by the way, probably the majority of them, but it's also educating how we're going to make these corporations listen, these oil corporations listen, even though they have all of the knowledge, you know.
They've had it since the 60s.
Exactly, and they're not listening. And so I think we kind of have to go to some of the old organizing tactics that we used back in the day, you know, with the boycotts or whatever, to make them understand and to make them listen. And I know that we were very successful back in, I think it was like in the 80s, when we were able to, when you and Tom did the big campaign to stop the nuclear plants in California. And had it not been for your efforts, we would have had so many nuclear plants in California. But the interesting thing is when that happened, we actually partnered with the agricultural industry. And that was the one time that we were on the same page, because they wanted to put a nuclear plant in the San Joaquin Valley.
Oh.
I think it was in Wasco. I can't exactly remember that. But we joined together with the growers to stop that.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that's, so we have to we have to educate, obviously, the communities at large, but then we have to somehow take that education and take it to the powers that be, to make them understand that they have responsibilities, you know, to do something about this also.
One of the ways that we're doing that is through the divestment campaign. It's called Stop the Money Pipeline, where we are asking people to, any monies that they personally have invested in banks or in insurance companies or money management funds, or that their universities or their churches or their temples or their pension funds withdraw from insuring and funding the fossil fuel industry. Because if we take away the funding that makes it possible for the fossil fuel industry to continue, then it will no longer be possible for them. So that's one thing that we're doing. But for example, you know, as you said, Bakersfield is, like in California, the center of the fossil fuel extraction. And we're going to be doing a Fire Drill Friday there, and we're going to be working with you and your foundation on that. So here we're coming there, and we're going to be saying that we have to issue no new, Governor Newsom has to issue no new permits for new wells, and we have to begin to close down existing wells. And yet a lot of those workers are Latinos. How do we communicate with them so they won't be against what we're doing and form an opposition to us?
Well, I think we have to figure out a transition. We have to, and it's kind of complicated because, number one, the types of wages that are paid to install solar panels, for instance, okay, they're low wages.
Yeah.
And people that work in the oil industry, they make higher wages.
Yeah.
And they are,
because they're unioned.
Yeah, so some of them are represented by labor unions, and they're going to fight for those workers. The other thing is because, like say in the San Joaquin Valley, the whole San Joaquin Valley, so your main industries that you have are agricultural, and then in Kern County is oil. So when you take away the oil, then you're putting thousands of people out of work. And then that creates an economic situation that is not very good for those workers. So I think when we think about transitioning, we have to think about what other industries could people transition into. I think some of them we could think about are the healthcare industry. I don't know if you know this, Jane, but in California several years ago, it was reported that we needed like 400,000 nurses in California. Okay, and that was several years ago. Well, to this date, like again in Kern County, if you want to be a nurse, you have to enter a lottery, and maybe you'll get chosen to be a nurse. So there's other industry that we can look at, and I'm going to throw this one in here too. In terms of the environment, is the hemp industry. Everything, every single piece of paper, everything that we make out of plastics can be made out of hemp, and they're doing this in countries like China. And the San Joaquin Valley would be perfect for that, to create a whole new industry and making some of our everyday products that we use to make them out of the stocks that they throw away. That could also be fashion. So I think we've got to be forward thinking so that these workers do not feel like that we are against them or we're taking away their jobs. The other thing that's kind of curious, Kern County is actually the leading county in terms of what it's done for the environment, in creating alternative jobs for the environment. They're the #1 county in the state of California that has done more in terms of creating environmental jobs than any other county. And it's kind of a paradox in a way. So I think we kind of have to be sensitive to, because people are saying jobs. The other sad thing in Kern County, it's one of the most illiterate cities in the country. Because the educational system has been mostly geared to keep them in the fields, keep them in oil, send them off to the military. It's like this feeding ground for all of these young people. Don't bother to get an education. And I actually had a school board member say this to us, because we've been fighting with the local school board for a long time. He said to me, these parents do not want their children to get an education. They want them to go work in agriculture or work in the oil fields.
Or go into the military.
Yeah, that's a direct quote. So that's kind of the mentality. So when we're talking about organizing, we have to talking about it's got to be comprehensive. It's not just people on the ground, but we've got to take that education to the people that are in control.
Yeah, that's very disturbing.
It is.
Yeah, wow. Now, I've been told that very cleverly, the fossil fuel industries that companies that are in Kern County have organized the first line responders, the firefighters, to be on their side. Are you aware of that? Do you know about that?
Oh, yes. I have to say to you, I wish you could have. I was there actually that day. I had to leave because I had to travel, and there were so many people. I know that I wasn't going to be able to testify. My daughter Camila, did testify, and she got an attack on social media about campaigning with Jane Fonda, and please don't send any donations to the Dolores Huerta Foundation. And as you know, you were the subject of many, many attacks back then when you were fighting the nuclear industry, and you were right, So it's just as, and I think a lot of the organizing, and you mentioned this earlier, we've got to create this movement that is so huge that, as you did also against the war in Vietnam, it's got to be so huge, and we're going to be getting attacked while we're doing it, but that people have to understand that this is something that's upon us, that it's something that we have to see how we can mitigate it, how we can manage it, because it's happening. The global warming is happening. Climate change is happening. And I think people understand that a little bit, but again, they don't know what to do about it.
Yeah. So, talking about a just transition for oil workers in Kern County, I know that they could be transitioned into jobs cleaning up the mines and the wells that no longer function or that aren't really yielding much oil or that have been orphaned. There's those jobs. And if we could get the oil companies to simply move them over, they would be good paying jobs. What other kind of jobs in that area, so they wouldn't have to move, could oil workers be transitioned into, in your opinion?
Well, I think that chances, like I mentioned, the health industry, I think, which is huge, and we have, again, in this particular area, even though it's one of the richest areas in the state of California, because ag and oil are huge. But as I said before, there has been no effort to educate people, even to get them into professional positions, so to speak, because the education has been so horrendous, especially for Latinos, and African American, for people of color there. So I think that's one thing that really has to be souped up. There is an organization called Bitwise. It's run by
What's it called?
Bitwise.
Bitwise.
Bitwise. It's run by a young Latina and a farm worker, a kid out of Carruthers near Fresno, California, who has actually formed this organization. They're coming into Bakersfield, and they're going to be educating, especially focusing on Latinos, for jobs in technology. Now, in Fresno, which there they created jobs for 5,000 young people to go into technical jobs.
Wow.
Yeah, because technology, as you know,
It's the future.
Yeah. And so something similar like that could be done in Bakersfield. And I think the hemp industry would be another one, because you could actually, it's agriculture, but if you could do this processing, and my son Ricky, whom you know, and this might sound a little vulgar, but he says, we've got to stop wiping our butts with the rainforest. Because if you can think of, all of the toilet paper, all of the paper towels, everything that we use, and when we think of schools and hospitals and businesses that would, use agricultural hemp to make these products, that would create an awful lot of jobs right then and there. Yeah. And I think that, I know Governor Newsom has appointed a very good person to be in charge of the environment in Sacramento, and I think a task force needs to kind of be composed and have some of our scientists, have some of our economists come together, and businesses, and say, okay, let's put our brains together. What do we have in the San Joaquin Valley that you don't have in Los Angeles? Land. We have land. There are things that we can do here to create jobs and transition out of oil. And so, and I think it's also, if we can take kind of a positive stance on this, because I think, again, maybe we can neutralize the attacks, and we could just start to say, people, kind of wake up. This oil's not going to be here any longer. Okay? So, no, as much as you want to honor and celebrate and salute oil, it's going to be gone. Wake up, it's going to be gone. So let's start now, today, start thinking, how do we transition these jobs, okay? And make sure people have places to work and to be able to feed their families, et cetera.
I was told, you mentioned transitioning to jobs, to nursing and things like that. The one hospital near Bakersfield has been closed, is that correct?
I'm not sure.
Not sure.
But let me say this, though, that hospital, which my son, Fidel, who's a doctor, actually worked at, he's not there any longer. He has, now he's the medical director for all of children with special needs in the Kern County area. But that hospital is in very much need of financial assistance, and it does need to be supported.
How do you see climate change affecting migration and the ability for people to sustain themselves financially?
Well, I think the climate change is very definitely part of one of the issues that people are leaving, especially in Central America, places like El Salvador, where we see that the climate change there is affecting the crops that people depend on to be able to feed themselves. And so what are people, they're not going to starve. When people are going to need food, they're going to go where they can find it. And I think that's part of their coming up north. And I think that also speaks to our policies of our country here, that we put so much money into the wars against people of El Salvador and Nicaragua and Honduras, and we think of all of that money that we spent in terms of, getting involved in their governments and whatever. And then we could just think about, how about spending the equal amount of money to really help these countries, to help them with their economies. Instead of seeing them as enemies.
I heard that farm workers in Honduras and Guatemala were suffering from kidney failures because of the heat. It was so bad, and that was one other reason why they were having to migrate.
Yeah, well, health is definitely, you think of older people, every time like there's a big, I'm thinking of places like Chicago, for instance, some of these cities where you have, especially people that are elder, they pass away, they die because of the heat. So it is a very big threat.
Yeah. What you've had so much experience with civil disobedience. What do you see the role of civil disobedience in the movement to stop climate change?
Well, I think it has a very big role because when the powers that be don't listen, then that's one way to call their attention, to what the issues are. Mm-hmm. And so I think it has. I mean, your campaign on the fire drills has brought an awful lot of attention throughout the country, and mm-hmm. and a lot of times people kind of think, oh, climate change. I'll put it right. I know it's there. It's in the back of my head, but I don't really think it's a priority. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what the fire drill has done, because we say, it's here. We've got to take care of it right now. We've got to do this fire drill. Just like your alarm going off in your house. Your house is on fire. Yeah. As Greta,
as Greta says,
the house is on fire. You've got to do something right now. Yeah. Put out the fire. Definitely.
I was interested to see that in her new book, Cristina Figueroa, who was one of the authors of the Paris Climate Treaty, she says civil disobedience is going to be critical to the climate movement. Absolutely. So, that's, I think so too. It has to become the new normal.
Definitely.
Yeah. What do you look for, where do you look for inspiration these days?
Well,
Where do you get inspiration?
I think the young people, especially people like Greta, the young people that are out there marching against gun violence, the DACA students who had the courage to stand up and say, no, they're undocumented and unafraid. You see the courage of these young people, women that have stood out there on the Me Too movement and denounced they're predators and people like that. So you find this courage that is coming up, and I think it's kind of a little bit different than the 60s, I believe. I get,
why? In what way?
I can't remember. And I know we had the Latino kids that are doing the walkouts, against the discrimination in the schools. That was part of the 60s also. But you have these kids that are just walking out of school for climate change, and it's massive. And it's not the kids of color. It's not just the Latino kids, African-American kids. It's the Anglo kids. And we know we had a lot of the Anglo kids during the Vietnam War, but that was because they were affected by the war, because they would get drafted. And this is different, I think, in many ways, because it's more universal. So they're not thinking just about themselves. They're thinking about all the people in the world that are going to be affected. So in some ways, it's got a very strong, I think, kind of a spiritual connotation to it. Mm-hmm. And I'm not just thinking about me. I'm thinking about the world. I'm thinking about all the people on the planet. And I think that's what makes it's bigger. It's sort of a bigger than life type of a movement that's going on right now.
Which is what's needed, since the problem is bigger than life.
You might say it is life itself. Yeah. You might say it is life itself, because the planet will be here, but maybe we, like the dinosaurs, will not be here anymore.
Yeah. So, Dolores's children went to the children's camp that my then husband Tom Hayden and I ran up north of Santa Barbara. And I remember one summer, I don't know if it was in the 80s or the 70s, you had brought your children to camp, and then you came over to my house, and we talked for quite a long time. And you were leaving the farm workers, the United Farm Workers, because you did not like the role that women were playing in that union. Clearly, well, obviously you are a woman, but you have always understood the unique role that women play in movements. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you think about the role of women right now?
Well, I like to quote Coretta Scott King, who said, "We will never have peace in the world until women take power." And I have kind of amended that to say feminists take power, because we know that not all women are feminists. But we also know that a lot of men are feminists. Okay, so I think that's it, and I think that's the important thing. And when people ask me, well, how do you describe a feminist? Well, a feminist is someone that cares about the environment and climate change, somebody who cares about immigrants' rights, cares about women's reproductive rights, cares about civil rights, cares about LGBTQ rights also, and somebody who really supports labor unions, worker organizations, and organizations in particular, you know, or in general, you might say. So I think that's what a feminist is, and I do believe that we have to kind of educate people on feminist values to begin with, because a lot of women, unfortunately, are still kind of stuck. They're stuck back there in the 50s, you might say, where they feel that they have to do whatever their husband or their boyfriend says, or somehow they are not fulfilled unless they have a man in their life. And also, so many women don't even understand the power that they have as women. That we have, I think, special powers like intuition, you know, that I think really help guide us a lot. But sometimes we sort of don't listen to those voices of power that we have within ourselves. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard because we have been so socialized to say, no, you're supposed to be accommodating, you're supposed to be supporting, you're not supposed to get out there and stand up for yourself, you know. And so we have to kind of change the mind thought of women so they can understand that they do have a lot of leadership and they do have a lot of power as women and as individuals. And so I think this, you know, this is what I think one of our jobs is to, and we can see, I was just in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and to see all of these women in the U.S. Congress, and to see a California legislature, and I think the state of Nevada now has a majority of women right now in their legislature, and the women leaders and the great things that they do. So we know that we need women as leaders, and we know that women in a family, they set the philosophy of the family. They are the ones that can promote the activism that the family can engage in. Mm-hmm. So I think we as women, we need to take the lead. I think we have less egos, you might say, and in terms of dominating other people, like Gloria Steinem says, you know, the whole thing about machismo is dominating. When we see what's wrong with our politics in our country, is that our country wants to dominate other countries. No, we've got to have a shared world. You know, we got going back to Standing Rock, where we saw that beautiful village of thousands of people sharing food, sharing water, sharing firewood, and all, again, going back to when humanity started, protecting each other, making sure each other had food, that everyone was taken care of, having doctors and clinics, you know, that are volunteering there to take care of people. I mean, this is what the world should be like, and I think that's what we have to strive for.
And somehow you feel that women tend in that direction more?
Well, I think that we as women, number one, when we think of wars, there's not a woman that wants to see her husband or her brother, her son or daughter get killed. You know, we want to protect our children. That's kind of our fiercest, you might say, motivation that we have as women, to protect our families. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about protecting our families, then that's what it should be all about. You know, all of the politics should be kind of focused on that. And then we can see ourselves not as just our individual family, but as a human family. Mm-hmm. And we do have the resources in this world that everybody can be taken care of, but we've got to fight to make it happen. So the greedy ones then don't have all of the power, and they don't have all of the wealth that we see happening now.
You know, during the 4 months that we were doing Fire Drill Fridays in D.C., and there would be the civil disobedience, and people would risk arrest, women always outnumbered men by sometimes 5 to 1, often older women. And these were people who came from all over the country. It was very interesting. And so it really made me, you know, think, what is it about women that make them care more about the environment and be more willing to kind of put their bodies on the line? What do you think?
Oh, it's always been that way. In the farm worker movement, for instance, women were always in the front lines of the picket lines. And I think when you look at labor unions, the Garment Workers Union, you know, the women that fought there for the people that were making clothes and doing the really hard work. In the hospitality movement. You see the union, Unite Here, the women that are out there, the hotel workers, the ones that make the beds and all that, they're the ones that are willing to go out there and, like you said, do the civil disobedience, get arrested, etc. And even in our organizing with the Dolores Huerta Foundation, and we organize really poor, low-income people, I would say that 95% of our leaders are women. We don't really purposely start that way. You know, we start organizing with families as men and women. But then when you come to doing the jobs, getting out there, doing the organizing, going door to door, et cetera, it ends up being mostly women in the leadership. It's interesting.
It's very interesting, yeah. I think that Coretta was right when she said
I think so.
What she said. Thank you, Dolores.
And when you ask me who are my heroes and my mentors, I have to say Jane Fonda is
Oh,
definitely
no,
one of them.
You're mine. You've been my inspiration for always.
Well, but I think the thing is this, Jane, is that a lot of the things that affect poor people, you know, you might say that you weren't affected. And I could say that for myself too, but kind of growing up in a middle class home, you know, having the privileges of the dancing lessons and the music lessons, and my mother was a businesswoman. And then I saw kids that didn't have those benefits of life or privileges like I had. And you, of course, could, you know, do like a lot of people, just talk about it and sympathize, sponsor, but you are the real deal because.
Well, my father was Henry Fonda, who played Tom Joad in Grapes of Wrath, and you live right close to Weed Patch, which Grapes of Wrath was filmed at.
Yeah.
And he played a farm worker. He played an Okie who had to flee Oklahoma because of the dust storms in the Great Depression, and became a farm worker and fought to unionize the farm workers who at that time were white. They were migrants, but within the United States, and that's, of course, happening more and more, too, where the immigration is now within the country happening.
That's a good thing I think that would be really good to remind people, because the people that we are talking to are the children and the grandchildren. But I think that would be a really good reference, because that's going to touch them, because that's something that their families live through. And a few of the old timers are still around. You know, a lot of them are now my age, for instance, but their children are still there, and they are the ones that are now that work in the oil fields, or the managers in these oil fields, whatever. I'm talking about the second level.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not the owners of Chevron or the board of directors of these oil companies.
So these are the descendants of the
descendants.
Anglo
Yes.
people who fled the Dust Bowl
Right.
in the 1930s during the Great Depression,
Right.
and migrated. They are immigrants,
right, they're
migrated
immigrant,
to
right.
San Joaquin Valley.
Yes,
Yeah. And I met, for example, I went to the Weed Patch Museum,
Right.
which has a little museum that shows, you know, the people who came, and one of the woman who runs it is a descendant,
Right.
and her child is there now too. So you're saying these are people who should have internalized
Right.
what it means to be a migrant.
Right.
Well, we're very grateful that your supporters, your foundation, are working with us to make our Fire Drill Friday that's going to take place there in May successful. And I want to thank all of you who have been watching for joining us now. And you can find out all about Fire Drill Friday by going on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. And if you want to find out where the Fire Drill Fridays are taking place, or if you want to start a Fire Drill Friday where you live, you can text Jane at 877-877. That's 877-877. I want to thank you again, Dolores, for being part of this.
Thank you, Jane, for inviting us to be part of it.